You may have noticed that there are 3 different videos on this YouTube channel about discrimination. One is specifically about the discrimination of African Americans, one is specifically about women, and then I'm kind of lumping a lot of other groups together in this video. Now, it doesn't mean that any of these groups that I'm going to discuss today or in this short video are any less discriminated against, but in American history anyways, women and African Americans were the 2 biggest groups because there were a lot of African Americans living in the United States, especially at the end of the Civil War, and women always make up half of the country. So we have more legislation and more examples to talk about, which is why I made them their own videos, okay? But they are no less or more important than the groups we're going to be talking about in this video. So first off, we're going to talk about some of the discrimination against Chinese Americans specifically. So most of the early legislation we see that's discriminatory against Chinese Americans is actually in California. And that is because for one, they're on the western part, the western coast, which means they're actually physically closer to China. And a lot of businessmen in the California and western part of the country that were building railroads helped all of these Chinese immigrants come over to help build the railroads, but also to work on farms and such. So we have a lot of Chinese Americans coming over to help build these railroads, and then suddenly there are people that are scared that they're going to take their other jobs. And so we see California pass all of these laws that really restrict a lot of the rights of these Chinese immigrants. They make them have special permits to own their own businesses. They actually say that they cannot become naturalized citizens of the United States, even if their kids are born here, which hopefully you guys know is unconstitutional because it actually says in the Constitution, if you're born here, then you're a citizen. And then, eventually, the federal government kind of stepped in and had California dial back some of those laws because it violated some treaties that we had with China at the time. But in 1882, this is like about 20 years or so after the end of the Civil War, the railroads are pretty much completed at this point, and the federal government is trying to restrict the amount of Chinese immigrants that can come into the country. So we have this Chinese Exclusion Act passed in 1882, and it says that no one that comes here to work no one that wants to work, I guess I should say, can emigrate here from China for 10 years. It also put a lot of restrictions on the Chinese that were already living in the United States, basically saying that they couldn't become citizens. Okay, this is a political cartoon from the early 1900s, which depicts some really nasty racial stereotypes against people from China. Okay, but essentially it kind of demonstrates how people thought of the Chinese immigrants at the time. They thought they were communists or socialists, and they just really didn't want them in the country, unfortunately. Japanese Americans were discriminated against quite a bit, but in slightly different ways. The biggest, most egregious thing that happened against Japanese immigrants was the Executive Order 966. Okay, and that happened in 1942, and this was when President Franklin Delano Roosevelt put all Japanese Americans in internment camps during the duration of World War II because they were worried that they were spies against the American government. And remember, almost all of these people were actually citizens of the United States, people that were born here, possibly people who had never been to Japan before in their life. And they were suspected of being spies. And we didn't put German Americans, everyone of German American descent, into an internment camp during World War II. It was just Japanese. So, it would absolutely seem like they were being discriminated against based on their race. Okay. Then in 1988, we had a law passed called the Civil Liberties Act. President Reagan signed this, and it gave a formal apology to those Japanese Americans who were put in internment camps, and it gave each surviving victim $20,000. Now, for those of you who can do math, you can see that that is a little more than 40 years after after this executive order was issued. So certainly there were quite a few people who were not living anymore when they get this reparation of $20,000 each. Um, and so some people have kind of said a little too little, a little too late. Okay, but the government did try and rectify that. Okay. The next group we're going to talk about is Native Americans. Now, um, this group actually probably has just as much history of discrimination against them as we see for Black Americans and women, because of course Native Americans lived here before anyone that comes from any other ethnicity besides being an American Indian. So they were here first, but of course we see early European settlers just moved in and kind of claimed the land. And that kind of started the discrimination against Native Americans. We had a long series of Indian wars, kind of back and forth fighting, different massacres happening, different battles, and eventually we see tribes being moved off to reservations kind of one by one. It wasn't necessarily all Native Americans being moved at the same time. It kind of happened little by little. A lot of times it was state governments that were doing this, but sometimes it was the federal government. One of the more notable and egregious um, times that a tribe was moved onto a reservation was the Trail of Tears in 1836. So prior to 1836 and the Trail of Tears, we had two Supreme Court cases that actually they were separate cases. Two different tribes in Georgia sued the state of Georgia for their right to basically stay on their land. And the Supreme Court actually sided with the Indian tribes both times, saying that they had just as much right to their land and that they were a sovereign nation and that the state governments could not take their land away and could not make them leave. Unfortunately, Andrew Jackson was president at the time, and he famously fought against Native American tribes for a very long time, killed a lot of them himself while at war, and really did not like Native Americans, and he did not think of them as equal to being equal to white people. So, unfortunately, he did not heed what the Supreme Court had said, and he basically said, well, the Supreme Court doesn't have an army and I do, so he didn't listen to their ruling. And unfortunately, 15,000 Creek Indians were marched from their home in Oklahoma out west, and about 3,500 of them died on the walk out there, okay, which is why it's called the Trail of Tears. You can see in the upper right-hand corner, I have a picture here. Sorry about that. I have a picture of, you can see, so this is the same three men in their traditional dress, and then essentially anglicized on the right-hand side. Okay, so their hair is cut, they're put in suits. And there was a very long history of like state governments, local governments, even the federal government, basically forcing children off the reservations with their families into these quote Indian schools where they taught them essentially like American culture. They wouldn't let them speak their native language, and they were basically trying to like kill the culture of whatever tribe they came from, unfortunately, and it was pretty effective. So we don't see a lot of Native Americans have lost some of their culture, unfortunately. Some modern discriminatory laws that affect different Native American tribes. We see the Dakota Access Pipeline. The Standing Rock Sioux tribe in South Dakota was really fighting against having this pipeline come through their land. They were saying, we're a sovereign nation, so you have no right to run it through there. And they've had some spills, some leaks from that pipeline, and it has ruined their drinking water. But unfortunately, the pipeline went through anyways, and they couldn't really do anything about that. Latin Americans, so I have Latina, Latino. There is a very long history of discrimination against Latin Americans. Most notably, we have up until the 1950s, they would not let Mexican Americans, even if they were citizens, serve on juries. Okay. Now, this was a much bigger deal in Texas, where there were a lot of Mexican American immigrants, I should say, Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans living. And so they actually, there was a case where a man who like had murdered someone, he was convicted by an all-white jury, so they sued, and the case got all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court actually ruled that it is unconstitutional to bar Mexican Americans from serving on juries, and his case was overturned, and then he was retried later. Okay, so pictured here are some of the lawyers who worked on this case, Hernandez versus Texas. Okay, so this is one of the times where the Supreme Court essentially was trying to make the discrimination better, or I shouldn't say discrimination better, that they were trying to rectify the past discrimination against Mexican Americans. And then we have some just general immigrant legislation that was kind of bad for essentially anybody who was an immigrant. In 1921, there was a law passed by Congress called the Emergency Quota Act, and that basically said that they would only let 3% of immigrants in from a country than what was there in 1910. So let's say, for instance, there were 300,000 immigrants from Germany living in the United States during the 1910 census. So they would only let 3% of 300,000 in from Germany. Okay, so so they would take the amount of people from that country, there were immigrants living in the country in 1910, and then it was 3% of them that we would let in. This was in response to a really large influx of Eastern European Jewish refugees. So there was obviously a lot of pogroms and violence against Jews in Eastern Europe. Okay, so not Scandinavia, sorry. So we see Poland, Ukraine, those types of Eastern, some of the Slavic countries. There was a lot of violence against them, and so they were trying to flee. It did not place any limits on Latin America. This was mostly just European countries. But actually, at some point, they realized it was still too many people coming in, and they later reduced that number to 2% of the people living there in 1910. Now this was replaced in 1965 with a system that's a little bit more closely resembling to our current system of immigration law, where it really doesn't matter what country you come from. It's more based on, do you have skills? Are you going to be a student? Are you going to college? Or do you have relation living in the United States already? Okay, so if like your parents are here, then they can bring their children over. And then lastly, the LGBTQ community has suffered a lot of discrimination in the United States. They still do, unfortunately. For basically since the dawn of the country, you could be fired from your job for just being identifying as gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual. That actually is still technically true in some states. It's still legal, and just yet sexual orientation has not become a protected class. For a very long time, they were not allowed to adopt children. That was state law in a lot of places. It is not anymore. Up until the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which was passed in 1994, you could be kicked out of the military if you came out publicly as gay. The idea between Don't Ask, Don't Tell in the 90s was that we're okay with you being homosexual, we just don't want to know about it. And if you want to be like out then you will get kicked out of the military. Okay, so people basically had to kind of stay in the closet essentially. That was repealed in 2011. Okay, so you can no longer be kicked out of the military for being gay. Many states had laws against same-sex marriage, and those laws were only struck down in 2015, 3 years ago, from the Supreme Court case Obergefell v. Hodges, which struck down any law that restricted people's right to marry based on sex. Okay, so now that those are some of the ways. So those are some examples of laws that discriminated against LGBTQ. The LGBTQ community and some ways that the government has tried to rectify that discrimination.